what's up? I'm Mr. Honish and welcome to my flipped classroom. Today we'll look at the largest country by land area in the entire world and the smaller and much less significant countries to the southwest of it. Sorry people of Georgian, Armenian, and Azerbaijani descent, we are talking about Mother Russia and the Caucasus. Speaking from a physical geography standpoint, Russia and the Caucasus include a wide variety of land and water forms and climate and vegetation zones. But I mean, how could it not? We're talking about almost 6.7 million square miles here. That's twice the size of the continental United States. Now you might remember the northern European plain from previous videos, and it stretches deep into western Russia and creates the most fertile soil in the country. Because it is the most fertile soil, it is also the easiest area to support human life. So you should be able to figure out why Russia's population density map looks like this. East of the northern European plain, the land rises into the Ural Mountains, which are usually considered the official boundary between Asia and Europe. That's why European maps usually only show the western chunk of Russia, and Asian maps often leave that western chunk out. East of the Urals is an area called Siberia, which is mostly synonymous with freezing cold wasteland. And for much of Siberia, that's a fairly accurate description. There is incredibly low population density, and most of the land is either marshy or covered in small mountain ranges. The very far east of Russia lies in the Pacific Ocean, and is more mountainous once again, largely because of its location on the Ring of Fire.
I fell into a burning ring of fire. I went down, 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 and the flames went higher. And it burns, burns, burns.
I had to. A tectonic plate boundary where earthquakes and volcanoes are common. So even though we're talking about Russia in the Europe video series, this eastern area of Russia neighbors China, Japan, and is right across the Bering Sea from Alaska. North of Russia is the Arctic Ocean, and it is often frozen, making transportation and fishing there difficult. Southwest of Russia, and sandwiched between the Caspian and Black Seas, are the Caucasus, a region named for the Caucasus Mountains that cover it, and home to those countries of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Yes, I said Georgia is a country. I am for real about that. There is a state named Georgia too, but they're not the same thing. Now, as you can probably imagine, the Caucasus Mountains and the seas have the greatest impact on how people live in that region. The Black Sea is arguably the most important body of water for the entire region for trade purposes because it is a warm water port that doesn't freeze, unlike the Arctic Ocean and Baltic Sea coastline that Russia has, and the major river networks like the Volga, Ob, and Lena, which are often useless for transportation in the long winter months. As far as climate goes, it's cold. I mean, like really cold. Like freeze Napoleon and Hitler's invasions in their tracks cold. It's warm enough to support taiga scrub brush in some parts of southern Russia, but mostly it's just cold. Even though the growing season is short, lots of grains are grown in the northern European plain area, but the most important resources are raw materials like copper and gold, timber, oil, and gas. The problem is, most of these resources were really poorly managed under the state-run command-style economy of the Soviet Union, which we'll talk a little bit more about in the next segment. Now before we get to the communism and Soviet Union part of the history, there's some pretty crazy stuff from way back in Russia too. First of all, if you think about how flat the western part of Russia is, you probably understand how it easily changed hands for hundreds of years as different powerful groups came in and out. Long story short, lots of the basics of Russian culture, like Orthodox Christianity and the Cyrillic alphabet, came from influence brought by the Slavs, the Rus, the Mongols, and other groups that controlled that region from the 800s through the 1400s. By the 1500s, control was seized from the Mongols by a dude named Ivan IV, who then crowned himself Tsar, which is like the Russian term for emperor. Ivan IV's nickname as Tsar became Ivan the Terrible. How terrible? Release bears into the city square, close the gates, and sit up on the roof to watch the bloodshed and terror of the townspeople for fun terrible. All the czars weren't so terrible though, and through the 16 and 1700s, Russia grew quite a bit and became a legit world power under Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. Side note, Russian history makes it really easy to tell who the good leaders were and who the bad leaders were. I mean, wouldn't US history be easier if we could just be like Abraham Lincoln the Great and Franklin Pierce the Terrible? While Russia was expanding at that time, they took much of the Caucasus, but not all of it. Parts of present-day Armenia were run by the Turks of the Ottoman Empire, who carried out a policy of ethnic cleansing against the Armenians. Some were lucky enough to get out of the country, but many thousands died. Anyway, one thing even the great czars could never figure out is how to help the vast majority of Russia's population that were poor peasant farmers. By the 1900s, the people were fed up thanks to Russia's entry into World War I, causing millions of death in battle and food shortages at home, and Tsar Nicholas II generally ignoring those problems to continue living his own life of luxury. The people overthrew him in 1917 and Russia got out of World War I. Later that year, a group called the Bolsheviks took power. They killed Tsar Nicholas II and his family, including his daughter Anastasia, contrary to what Disney would have you believe about her escaping to get to her grandmother in France or whatever. And they installed a communist government, rebranding their country as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, aka USSR, aka Soviet Union. After World War I, with Russia in disarray and the Ottoman Empire having collapsed, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan had gained their independence in the Caucasus. But that was short-lived with the creation of the Soviet Union in 1922, and all three of them became republics within the USSR. Soviet Union was under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin until his death in 1924, when this guy named Joseph Stalin won a power struggle to replace him. Through the rest of the 20s and 30s, Stalin was busy setting up a command economy where the government made all production and pricing decisions, as well as eliminating rivals. Anyone that spoke out against Stalin faced execution, or if they were really lucky, a 1 to 3 decade sentence at a gulag, or Soviet labor camp in Siberia. To support Stalin's reorganization into a command economy, he ordered the killings of hundreds of thousands of prosperous peasants called kulaks, so they could take their money and materials and refocus it into building Russia's industry. When Stalin's policies began failing, more killings were ordered in places like Ukraine and Kazakhstan as punishment. Yikes. When Germany invaded Poland to kick off World War II, you might recall from a previous video that Germany and the Soviets were originally on the same side, until Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. But when that happened, all of a sudden the US and Britain and other allies were in the awkward position of having to cooperate with Stalin, even though they didn't particularly like him. So they put on a fake smile and fought World War II to a successful conclusion. After the war, as you may remember from a previous video, the Soviet Union kept lots of the land they had won in Eastern Europe and set up communist governments there, because honestly, as much as the US and Western Europe distrusted the Soviets, they distrusted us on an equal level. And so began the Cold War, a half-century rivalry of amassing ever larger weapons stockpiles and fighting to influence countries around the world in their choice of government and economy style. Until the Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of its long-term failures in the early 90s, leading to Russia and the 14 other republics to break up and become independent. Now the good news was that Russian culture was back after being crushed by the Soviet government for so long. Once again, religious excitement blossomed and people were happy to join the free market and own Western clothing and listen to Western music. To look at how people live today in different regions of Russia, I am giving you a short homework assignment. Yeah, in the middle of the video. So hopefully you convince all your classmates that don't watch these things to at least get this assignment done. Here goes. Starting at the end of page 389 in your textbook, there is a passage describing how life differs in the various regions within Russia. It extends to the end of page 391 and includes a pretty nice map breaking it down. It's less than 2 textbook pages of reading, so don't freak out. For your assignment, I want you to summarize what life is like in all 6 regions on a separate sheet of paper. That's it. Thanks. Anyway, the transition from communism to democracy and command economy to market was far from easy, and it certainly created winners and losers. Georgia has struggled, and despite the revival of the Georgian Orthodox Church, there have been many ethnic difficulties that led to civil war, protests, and revolutions there. Armenia has also had its fair share of troubles, including a war with neighboring Azerbaijan over its disputed border area, mostly inhabited by ethnic Armenians, but within the political boundaries of Azerbaijan. Speaking of Azerbaijan, it is the cultural outcast of the Caucasus, as the only predominantly Muslim country there. They also have a fair amount of oil, which you would think would bring it wealth and prosperity, but corruption has produced a huge gap between the rich and poor. Similarly, Russia has produced several billionaires, but also millions of people struggling to put food on the table. The government has been full of corruption, bribery, and dishonesty, which I know is kind of a common theme for politicians around the world, but we're talking about like ridiculous amounts of corruption, bribery, and dishonesty. In 1999, a former KGB agent, which is like the Soviet equivalent to the CIA, named Vladimir Putin, became president of Russia. After 2 terms of his presidency, he couldn't be re-elected according to Russia's constitution. So his right-hand man, Dmitry Medvedev, became president, and a day later he named Putin as his prime minister. Now, nobody can say this for sure, but in Medvedev's term from 2008 to 2012, Putin was basically running the show. When it came time to elect a president in 2012 again, what do you know? Putin ran and won, and he won amid lots of protests and criticism about the fairness of the election, too. So Putin has been in charge for like 16 years. Amid charges of voting fraud and corruption in the top levels of the government, as well as elimination of possible political rivals through jailing, and even in some extreme cases, mysterious deaths. And also small invasions into former Soviet republics like Ukraine, which was in a previous video, and also the Caucasus country of Georgia. As you might imagine, underinformed Americans freaked out a little when news reports of Russian tanks rolling into Georgia were being broadcast. People were like, "Oh, my Atlanta! The Russians are marching to Atlanta!" So honestly, Russia's people today seem to be trying to succeed with democracy and the free market, while the government has kind of been acting a lot like the Soviet Union once did. The US still doesn't seem to trust Russia, and Russia still doesn't seem to trust us. It's an interesting dynamic that will surely play out further as time passes, so keep your eye on it. But for now, go study, admire my Russian-themed Alabama Crimson Tide hat, and until next time, bye-bye!